You guys can see our slides progress, right? Perfect. So yes, we would like to start with some introductions. I'm Krista Obstedal. I am the Project ECHO Director here at the North Dakota Center for Persons with Disabilities at Minot State University. And Kyle, can you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Kyle Erickson. I'm a research associate here at Minot State.
Thanks, Kyle. Jody?
I'm Jody Patchen, and I am the Administrative Assistant for Project ECHO.
Thank you, Jody. Jessica?
Hi, I'm Jessica Reiswig, and I'm the mentor coordinator at ASTEP and project support on ECHO.
And Linda Anderson.
Hi, I'm Linda Anderson. I work at the University of Minnesota's Institute on Community Integration.
Jen?
Welcome, everyone. I'm Jennifer Hall-Landy. I also work at the University of Minnesota Institute on Community Integration with Linda, and also I'm a former direct support professional.
Thanks, Jen. We are very excited for today. If you are just now getting admitted, please feel free to log on to menti.com and you can follow the prompts on your screen there by entering that code. This will allow you to submit questions and also provide us your information so we can follow up with the resources from today. And we are very excited to introduce Alison Traynor. She is our presenter today, and she's going to talk a little bit about the impacts of trauma. Alison has worked for over 11 years as a crisis social worker and trainer across North Dakota state and tribal lands. She co-founded North Dakota's nonprofit with 200 plus members, which is the statewide Suicide Prevention Coalition. And in 2019, she was named 40 under 40 in public health by the Beaumont Foundation for her work in suicide and violence prevention and recovery support. Please help me in welcoming Alison.
Oh, thank you so much. This is so exciting to be doing a presentation with Project ECHO and the Center for Persons with Disabilities. I am Alison Traynor. I'd love it if you could, is it allowable for everyone to have their cameras on if possible, or no? If you so choose, that would be really great, just so that I can see your lovely faces. If you don't feel comfortable, that's fine as well. I'm going to be talking about resilience. So I'm going to be talking about preventing and recovering from vicarious trauma. So hopefully, as I talk about trauma and sort of describe what it looks like and what it might look like in your work, that I can also give you some real actionable items that you can do immediately so that you can use this information. Next slide. So a little bit about me. For the last 3 years, I've been working as a clinical social worker. So my lens is really looking at the whole person in the environment. I'm going to be talking a lot about trauma today and some impact of trauma on the brain, but please know I'm not a neuroscientist, so I'm going to simplify some things. So if your interest is neuroscience, you might catch that I oversimplify a lot of different subject matter, and that's because I'm thinking more holistically, like a social worker. So my experience is very much in crisis work, but I also worked for several years as a direct support professional, working in homes. I currently work with individuals who are experiencing suicide crisis, as well as individuals that have experienced sexual exploitation or trafficking. And lastly, I do a lot of in-home work with families. So those are things that certainly shape my understanding of vicarious trauma, but I'm really looking at this from my experience as a direct support professional, as well as a coordinator of work with individuals with disabilities, as well as mental illness. Next slide. So when you think of traumatic stress, what comes to mind? If anyone wants to pop something in the chat or even unmute yourself, what do you think of? What comes to mind when, is there a picture in your mind's eye or a thought that comes to mind when you think of traumatic stress?
Unexpected death in the family, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. Anything, any unexpected death or injury. What else?
I think of abuse.
Yeah. Violence. Anything else? Good answers. Yeah, absolutely. Next slide. So what often comes to people's minds, are violence, significant loss, veterans or service members, sexual assault victims are just some of the things that are very common that we think of when we think of traumatic stress. Next slide. But what about helping professionals? What about individuals whose loved ones or work is very acutely stressful? Individuals that are faced with really difficult situations that they're expected to respond to. What about those situations where someone's experiencing a physical or a mental health crisis, and you're the one person in their home or the one person that's able to respond or that knows them best, and you feel underprepared or undertrained to respond? Next slide. So today I'm going to be talking about these issues. I'm going to talk about what trauma is and how it shows up in our work. I'm going to talk about vicarious trauma as just another sort of type of trauma. Then I want to talk about what helps, prevention, as well as what to do after a vicarious trauma-related crisis occurs, either with ourselves or our colleagues. And then what you can do today to build resilience. Next slide. So I'm just going to define trauma. This is how OVC defines trauma. You'll find lots of really good definitions, but trauma is a lasting emotional response that results from living through a distressing event, witnessing or learning of, being told about a distressing event experienced by a person close to you, which may be someone that you work for or with. Experiencing a traumatic event can cause harm to a person's sense of self, how we feel about ourselves, our safety, and our ability to regulate our own emotions and navigate relationships. It can impact every aspect of a person's life. Next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how trauma impacts the brain. Now, this is an oversimplification, but it's just one way of kind of understanding how this physical bodily response that occurs every time we experience one of these distressing events. So I'm going to start by talking about the brainstem, which is the lower part of the brain, which develops first in utero. And this actually controls our responses and our survival responses and our autonomic responses like breathing, sleep, and temperature regulation. So that is a part of the brain that we find in pretty much all animals, right? Most animals, whether it be a lizard, a bird, like animals have a brainstem. As we go up and to the higher parts of the brain, we see that other animals do not either have these parts of the brain or they're like underdeveloped. And so this, as we go up, these are more sophisticated parts of the brain. The midbrain, or the limbic area, is the part of the brain that develops next. There's two important areas of the brain, the midbrain, the amygdala and the hippocampus. The amygdala acts like a brain smoke detector. So it alerts us that something is, we need to take notice of something and that it is a potential threat to our safety. And the hippocampus connects the lower and the upper parts of the brain. These are important in the expression of emotions and memory. And so the hippocampus is often responsible for encoding specific memories that are really emotionally powerful. We can't remember all things. We tend to remember the things that are very, cause us to feel some kind of way. And so that is, the hippocampus is often responsible for some of those activities. And then the last part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex that we're going to talk about, which is the most sophisticated part of the brain that takes up the most energy. So this upper part of the brain develops last and is responsible for our ability to pause, to think critically, to reflect, to problem solve, and all of that sophisticated, those things that many other, the other animals just are not capable of doing at the level that humans are able to do. Next slide. So another way to look at this is Perry's neurosequential model. So Dr. Perry's work is very exciting, and I would recommend that anyone that is interested in the subject matter look up Dr. Perry's work and publishings. But this model shows in a different way that the brainstem is really the first thing that develops, which is also sort of thought of as our lizard brain, our very old brain that develops first, that is responsible for fight, flight, and freeze. Then as we move up, we have the midbrain, which is also responsible for coordination and movement. The limbic system, which is that encoding of emotional responses. And lastly, that cortical, or what in the prefrontal cortex, is also, our problem solving, controlling ourselves, as well as literacy and empathy. Next slide. So how this all comes together and why this is important is that trauma really impacts the brain, and we can see this. We can see it on brain scans. We can see how this unfolds. And so these distressing events really do impact our physiology. So what I like to start with is the amygdala. So when a traumatic event occurs, our amygdala activity increases. So the amygdala acts as a smoke alarm for a stressful event. It helps protect us from danger. Trauma can cause the amygdala to stay overactive, especially if you have a repeated exposure to trauma, either yourself or hearing of something traumatic, because it turns out when we hear about something traumatic, our mind's eye actually develops a story. We can see it play out in our mind's eye, and our brain and body sometimes cannot tell the difference between what we're actually experiencing and what is just imagined. But anyways, this stimulation can lead to feelings of anxiety or even being in danger during the event, but sometimes after the event, it can really impact our nervous system. Next, when the amygdala is stimulated and we go into fight, flight, or freeze mode, which often that's what the brain tells our body to do to protect itself in a dangerous situation, our hippocampus shrinks. So the hippocampus assists with learning and memory storage, and we talked about how this information includes information on safety and how to keep one's body and mind safe in a situation where there's danger. It helps calm the amygdala. Trauma can actually cause the hippocampus to shrink. So these cues of calming the amygdala actually are weakened, which may cause flashbacks or confusion around a traumatic memory. Next, the last part that's impacted of the brain during a traumatic experience is the prefrontal cortex. So in brain scans, we can see that when someone is triggered by a traumatic event or something that reminds them of the traumatic event, the prefrontal cortex shrinks or becomes less active. And you can see this for a lot of people. It's almost like lights out. When they're triggered by a traumatic event, this prefrontal cortex essentially goes offline. The prefrontal cortex manages thoughts, behavior, and helps us control our emotional responses to any event. Normally, this area helps us decide that a situation is okay and safe, but trauma can actually weaken the signals from this area, allowing negative emotions from a trauma memory to take over, and the prefrontal cortex reasoning ability may shut down essentially. So again, this is an oversimplification, but what I like to remember is that when you're facing a traumatic event, the amygdala is stimulated. It might put you into fight, flight, or freeze mode, and it essentially shuts its lights out to the prefrontal cortex, which has all your problem solving abilities, and this really can challenge our ability to think critically in difficult situations. Another thing that I like to remember about this is that we have a tendency to freeze, fight, or running in dangerous or traumatic situations. So when we're triggered, oftentimes we may be predisposed to do one of those three things. And you might think of this in your own work. If you're working with someone and you're exposed to a potentially dangerous situation in their home, or you feel unsafe with a client that might be acting aggressively, you might have a tendency to want to fight, or become maybe more verbally responsive, or you might have a tendency of just wanting to get out of there and run, or you might freeze. So those, you might just notice in yourself that you tend to respond in one of those three ways. Next slide. So to kind of summarize this, we talked about trauma's impact on the brain. I also wanted to mention that when we're amid a potentially traumatic event or a triggering event, something that triggers or reminds us of past traumatic events, not only does it impact your brain like that, it also impacts your nervous system, where your heart rate might increase, you might begin perspiring, you might also have cortisol, or the stress hormone, coursing through your veins, and you might start releasing adrenaline so that you're preparing to fight or to flee the situation. So you can imagine that if you're exposed to something distressing or stressful in your work or in your personal life repeatedly, that could really impact your adrenals. That could really impact the functioning of your brain, and really how your body is responding on the daily. So one thing that I like to note is that our brain is resilient, but one way I look at this is when stress exceeds our ability to cope, we can experience a mental health crisis. So there is hope. Our brains are resilient. We can experience traumatic events, and we can experience a lot of really tough stuff. But as we move through this presentation, I want you to think in terms of each of us having a scale. On one side, you have all the difficult stuff, all the traumatic stuff in your life, all the stressors of your work or your personal life. And on the other hand, we have all of the protective factors, all the good stuff in your life, all those positive memories, but also the supports, your healthy activities, your positive friends, whatever you might call are the good stuff in your life. And so what I want to have you keep in mind is that we want to tip the scales towards the good stuff. And how can we do that? Next slide. So in summary of all of this, the brain has natural ways of healing itself, which we're going to get to, strategies to do that. It is resilient, but with repeated exposure to traumatic events, the brain and the body may become overwhelmed. When a traumatic event occurs, it triggers our amygdala, which is often called our old lizard brain. This triggers our survival response of fight, flight, or freeze. Now experts are also talking about a partial freeze response of appease. That's sort of like if your response to a traumatic situation or being threatened is to really appease the other person, be very agreeable, be very responsive to their needs. That's another response that we find in trauma literature. So when you're triggered by an event or by your client, sometimes you could be triggered by something as simple as a tone, a smell, an environmental cue, or a situation that reminds you of childhood trauma or a work-related trauma. You may find yourself triggered. When we're triggered, it's essentially lights out to our prefrontal cortex or our problem-solving mechanisms. With repeated exposure, the impact is what we're going to be talking about for the next couple of slides. Next slide. So I've been talking a lot about general trauma, just a couple things to understand about the brain's response to trauma, and that it is real, it's physiological. So what is vicarious trauma? Vicarious trauma or traumatization is a negative reaction to trauma exposure that includes a range of psychosocial symptoms. So this is used broadly to include other related terms like secondary traumatic stress. You might hear of compassion fatigue and critical incident stress. So a lot of times these are used interchangeably, but generally speaking, I just think of vicarious trauma as a type of trauma. In our work, it shows up as hearing of a traumatic experience of those we serve. You might be experiencing emotional or physical abuse by our clients in some instances. Sometimes we can work with clients that can be verbally abusive. Handling emotional and physical health crises of our clients, or being the person they trust to hear about their traumatic experiences, feeling unsafe or helpless in our clients' homes, and you want to experience that. Or when you're out in the community, you know, getting stuck in a dicey situation and there's just no one out in the community to help you. Feeling helpless to help our clients amid their extremely limiting circumstances, not receiving the support we need from an overburdened system or an under-resourced organization. Does any of this sound familiar? Next slide. So what can it look like? What does it look like when folks are at risk of vicarious trauma? I see that, Jennifer. Yeah, it does sound familiar. What does this look like? So it might look like a really excellent employee. It might look like you are a very dedicated client-centered professional. It might look like overextending, really going above and beyond for clients. A personal history of trauma. Oftentimes, those of us that are doing this work, I just, one way I'd put it is like, you tend to not go into this work if you haven't gone through some rough stuff. A lot of us may have experienced some type of adversity that made us want to help others. Pre-existing mood disorders will also increase your risk. Depression, anxiety, any of those types of things, which when you think about it, 1 in 5 have a diagnosable mood disorder. So you think about that, that's just going to be a large proportion of folks that are serving individuals. Unhealthy coping mechanisms. So we live in North Dakota, and what do we do in North Dakota? What do a lot of people do for fun in North Dakota? There's a lot of binge drinking, you know, and we like big meals. Yeah, many people drink it. Yeah, in Minnesota as well. Absolutely. It's we are just in the Midwest. Sometimes we struggle to talk about our feelings. Sometimes it's more socially acceptable to go out drinking with our coworkers or to go out, you know, and I'm not saying that any of these things are bad. They're just when used in isolation as a coping strategy, they tend to put us at risk. Isolating, you know, if we have a really stressful job, it can feel like a lot to even go out after work. And then things that are self-harming or that could be detrimentals, like cutting, those types of things, of course, are going to increase risk as well. In the literature, being younger in age is also a risk factor. And I think that's just, you know, fewer relationships, maybe less developed life outside of work. Lack of life outside of work is a risk factor. Just, you know, not having hobbies, not spending time with folks outside of work, not having a lot of those additional supports, and having limited professional experience so that you may not have a frame of reference if your boundaries are being pushed by your employing agencies. If you're being asked to do things that maybe are pushing your personal boundaries, you might not have a frame of reference to even know that's happening. Next slide. Another way of looking at this is just the continuum of symptoms, or one way of looking at vicarious trauma and its relationship to secondary trauma. You know, you see pretty much similar symptoms here. Compassion fatigue, you see similar symptoms. Relationship disturbances, somatic symptoms, which is really just when our body is telling us that we're overextended or that something's wrong. Headaches all of a sudden, gastrointestinal problems. Just, you know, sometimes when we don't slow down, when we need to be slowing down, our body will slow us down for us. And then the last thing that we're really trying to prevent is burnout. So that's the total depletion. That's when we get to the point of withdrawing from work, becoming negative or cynical. And this is when folks might be at increased risk of suicide. Next slide.
So big picture, I think it's equally important to talk about organizational risk factors and what it can look like in our organizations and what needs to change in organizations to really support employees in being healthy. And those are limited supervision. And, you know, sometimes, and I really feel for supervisors, because sometimes you're so busy filling shifts that are not filled. You're so busy sometimes doing work that isn't really within the role that your actual role, that it's hard to provide that supervision. It's hard to carve time out of the week or the month to do the supervision that you feel good about. And at least and maybe no one in this Zoom call relates to that, but that was my experience when I did this work. Working with too many clients, just having too many high needs clients on your team. Yeah, totally, really, absolutely. It's so common. It's like you have a client that's high needs, or it's requires a lot of cares, and it's hard to keep that client staffed. And so then you end up filling the shifts, and it gets really hard. Isolation for anybody in this situation. Having limited training about vicarious trauma and how to prevent it. Working with a high percentage of highly traumatized clients. So folks that really trust you and want to share their stories with you, which is a gift in one hand, right? But at the same time, it can be really difficult and triggering over time. Working with clients who are underserved and disadvantaged. So when we realize that there are systems issues that we can't solve, and we are doing so much work just to meet the needs of our clients and addressing systems issues, it can be really difficult. Working for poor pay under stressful conditions with limited resources, putting in way more than 40 in a week, but feeling like you really can't get overtime because you know how difficult that is for the agency. And then lack of acknowledgement by the agency that vicarious trauma exists. Just like I went through it, you need to go through it too. This is just, earn your stripes. Lack of acknowledgement by the agency that vicarious trauma is a normal reaction. So when you actually start struggling because you've been going above and beyond, just that feeling, that feeling of shame or guilt that you need time off or that you're responding in this way. Next slide. So this is a list of symptoms of vicarious trauma, and it is not exhaustive. I have a note here from Krista. I get hung up on systemic issues and sometimes find myself thinking cynically. Absolutely. Yep. It is. You feel like, well, there's no point in even trying to do this because I know that I'm not going to get what my needs met or my needs met of my clients. I've already went through this system. There's too many hoops and it's not gonna work. Yeah, absolutely. That cynicism about the system is so common. Experiencing lingering feelings of anger, rage, and sadness about a client situation. Where at the end of the day, you find that this is like what you're talking about. Anger about the system or anger about what your clients are facing when you go home, and your spouse is like, yeah, like you need some hobbies, honey, I've been there. I don't know. Becoming overly involved or emotionally involved with your client's well-being, withdrawing from work. So this is kind of when we start getting to that point of frustration and cynicism where I'm now withdrawing, experiencing inappropriate guilt, shame, or feelings of self-doubt about your work because you feel like I should have done this or I should have, coulda, woulda, ruminating about work situations or completely checking out of them, being preoccupied with thoughts of the patient outside of work over identification with the client. So maybe thinking about just like the horror of their experiences or feeling like really that strong desire to rescue them. Loss of hope, pessimism, cynicism, distancing from the work, numbing, detaching, cutting our clients off, staying busy so that you don't have to feel feelings, avoiding listening to the client's story of experiences, or just avoiding talking to them because you know it's going to come up. Difficulty maintaining those boundaries with clients. You know, you're like, I know no one else is going to do it. No one else is going to help them. I'm the only person in their world. And so then you start being pretty flexible with those boundaries. Muddy thinking, feeling like you can't access memories or information that normally came freely to you. So all of a sudden, sometimes you might start feeling those symptoms of depression and anxiety. So if your nervous system is revved up from vicarious trauma, you might be in that state of fight or flight. You might start being very anxious. Your mind's running a million miles an hour. And when you feel that way, it can be really hard to be in the present and to pay attention to what's happening right here and right now. And that can feel like a bad memory. You know, you might have trouble remembering things as a result of that anxiety, and that being your nervous system being triggered all the time. On the flip side of that, if you are constantly faced with these experiences or repeated traumatic events, or being told about traumatic events, or facing some of the things we talked about earlier, it's very possible that your adrenals might start to struggle, and you might actually start facing some depressive symptoms, and that's where you see people starting to check out and be more appear more stereotypically burnt out. So when you think about people who are burnt out or cynical about the work, it can be easy to feel like maybe they're lazy, or there's things, you know, there's it's just them. But also remember that there are physiological things that are happening when people are doing the work for a long time. And and that can contribute to burnout. Panic attacks or acute anxiety, we can start seeing that on the job. And sometimes it seems like it came out of nowhere. Not eating enough or eating too much. Now, these are just your stereotypical depression symptoms and symptoms of anxiety and post-traumatic stress symptoms, dissociation, or just completely zoning out, checking out. And if all of these symptoms continue, if you're experiencing a lot of these symptoms and do not identify or seek help for these issues, then thoughts of suicide can result because of the emotional pain. Next slide. One of the last things I wanted to mention, I know this has been kind of a lot of rough information, and so I promise I will get to the good stuff about what you can do or what the research says you can do. But just another thing that I wanted to mention is that there's been a lot of research by the Kaiser Permanente organization, and different researchers, Felitti, different researchers have looked at the relationship between traumatic events, particularly in early childhood. But now there's more and more research that says, you know, there's a real strong correlation between any traumatic experience and negative health outcomes. So exposure to trauma, particularly in childhood, but really any type of trauma, increases people's level of distress and stress. Just really struggling to cope. And what ends up happening if we don't take action to develop positive coping strategies, we end up falling into less helpful coping strategies, like drinking, like overeating, and that can contribute to things like addiction or other health conditions, diabetes, heart disease, and that increases the risk of early death as well as suicide. So I know this is the last really, one of the last bummer slides, but just to note that there is hope, that this is where we can intervene. The development of less helpful coping strategies, if we insert positive coping strategies, we can get better. Next slide. So a simple way to think about this, what are coping strategies and what is important to remember? So the factors that really contribute to burnout when we're facing repeated vicarious traumatic situations are isolating from others on and off the job, feeling like there's no purpose or meaning in your work or outside of your work, and then poor coping strategies. Next slide. So what does that mean? That means that we have real clear direction on what helps people recover and prevent burnout. And so the way I look at this is the opposite of the previous slide is true, that belonging and connection, like positive relationships on and off the job, a sense of purpose and meaning in our work, feeling like we can make a difference, if not at work, then somewhere else. And then positive coping skills are what are protective. Next slide. So how do you know that I need to take action? We talked about the symptoms and the signs and the risk factors, but more simply, if you're wondering, is this something I need to worry about? Know your signs. We all struggle sometimes. No one's getting through this life without ups and downs, but knowing our warning signs will help us all. We tend to fall into one of three buckets when we're under stress. Some of us are going to be down in the dumps. We tend to withdraw, want to sleep. Any down in the dumps people here? How about our worriers? Some of us tend to be more anxious and worried. Our mind's going a million miles an hour when we're under stress. Anxious, yeah. And yes, Jessica, here's my worriers in here. Angry or irritable. Some of us have a cocktail of all three. Yeah, lots of worriers, I bet. Taking care of other people all the time, really accustomed to worrying. Yeah. So knowing your indicators will help you know when you need to get into gear and to develop some positive coping strategies. Next slide. So this comes actually from the broader world of resiliency. This is called our Sources of Strength Wheel, which is basically based on research into hundreds, now thousands of people who had struggled with a mental health crisis, a significant mental health crisis, even overdose, even a suicide attempt, trauma related and not trauma related. And they found people that had survived a real crisis, a real mental health crisis, and they asked them, how did you get better? And what they found out is that most people, well, actually everybody that they talked to, used at least 3 or more of these strategies and really leaned into them. And that's how they got through a hard time and actually got better. So you think about family support, it could be a biological or chosen family, could be positive. Anyone in here have a negative friend? Anyone relate to that? And that's not going to cut it. We need positive friends, people that are going to lift us up, want what's best for us. Mentors, that could be a supervisor, anyone that sponsor, anyone that's done more life than us. Healthy activities, generosity. So healthy activities could actually be anything. It could be underwater basket weaving. It could be art. It could be gaming. It could be running. Doesn't matter if it's physical or not. Generosity. So most of us that are in the helping profession, we're very generous. We often give. And so I don't think any of us in this call are going to have trouble with generosity. However, we have to make sure it's not the only piece of the pie that we're really leaning into, because that's where we get into trouble. Spirituality is anything that lifts our spirit up. And, oh, did I do that? Whoops. Anything that lifts our spirit up. It could be organized religion. It could be just a belief system, but could be a mindfulness practice. If you don't really fit with this, sometimes people will substitute or use a gratitude practice. Writing down 3 things that they're grateful for every day for 21 days has been demonstrated to actually change people's brains on a brain scan. The next one is medical access. And that is really, sometimes we need medication. Sometimes, we can treat our diabetes, get a proper medication for that. Sometimes we can get proper medication for our depression, and it can make all the difference in our life. And then mental health, we all have mental health, but this is practices maybe like journaling. It might be actually meeting with a therapist, or it could be a support group. So anyways, think about really leaning into some of these when you're struggling with vicarious trauma. Next slide. We all know it, right? We need to talk about it. This work is hard and it's confidential. So a lot of times we might not want to talk about it, but we need to. Now, at work, make sure you have a plan for someone that you're talking to or that you can talk to. outside of work. Talk about, okay, 5 minutes. Talk about the impact of the trauma, not necessarily what happened. If you can't talk about it, say with your partner or your friends, talk about the impact it's having on you. Next slide. This is a list of strategies. Increase self-observation. So if you relate to a lot of what I'm saying, start writing down what's happening when you experience fight, flight, freeze, or appease responses, or simply journal about your stress and what's happening, and start tracking that so you know when it's happening, what leads up to it, and what seems to be effective afterwards. Take care of yourself emotionally, engage. So a lot of times people will be like, get a massage. Well, not a lot of us have time or money for a massage. So think about other self-care strategies that soothe you, whether it be music and podcasts, going out in nature, nurturing yourself, using temperature. Some people really can regulate their emotions and stress response by actually taking a cold shower and then like a hot bath. It sounds kind of wild, like cold showers would not be pleasant, but or taking a cold pack and putting it over our eyes or in the back of our neck actually drops our heart rate and helps us concentrate on the experience rather than the distressing event. Intense exercise of any kind, even for just a few moments, can really change our frame. Paced breathing and progressive muscle relaxation. That's tip. You can use any mix of these, and there's so many apps for breathing and that type of thing. But look after your physical and mental well-being, of course. So advocate for yourself on the job, maintain healthy work-life balance. So finding those outside of work interests, being realistic about what you can accomplish. So really taking a look at, are my expectations of myself reasonable? Am I experiencing guilt and shame about my performance? And is it reasonable or is it inappropriate? Taking responsibility for my patients' well-being and their mood. Sometimes we end up trying to regulate our patients' emotions. We feel responsible if they're upset or sad, when really that is their experience. And we cannot be responsible for their emotions. Balancing our caseload, talking to our supervisors if we have too many difficult cases, or if it seems to be out of balance. Regular breaks can't overstress that. Take your breaks if there's any possible way. Seeking social support in and outside of work. A buddy system is recommended. Use peer supports. Take up these training opportunities. And I think everyone that does this work is entitled, but also really can benefit from therapy. Say not everyone needs therapy, but just about everyone can benefit from it. I certainly do it because I work with a lot of clients that are really struggling, and I just feel like it's my ethical responsibility. Next slide. One of the few things I want you to remember from this is a hot walk and talk. Something stressful happens to you, what do? So make sure that you talk to someone as soon as possible to debrief. You don't have to talk about exactly what happened, but how you feel, how it impacted you, because we don't want to re-traumatize each other, but we want to talk about our experience. And that's what, and process kind of what we feel responsible for. Because oftentimes if we're stressed about something, it's because we are taking more responsibility for something than we need to. So after the event, our cortisol is coursing through our veins. We talked about the impact of the event on our brains and how it impacts the prefrontal cortex and can kind of shut it down. Well, we want to get that prefrontal cortex working again. So find a buddy, go for a walk, and grab a whole deal of water and drink it. Walk and talk. This is a hot walk and talk, and what it does is it flushes the cortisol out of your body. And it's just really important, especially after a traumatic event. Process what led up to the event, what happened, without sharing that trauma, the details of the trauma with the individual you're talking to. All right, next slide. It's done. So I've talked about a lot of stuff. What helps me? So what helps me is keeping purpose in mind. on or off the job. Sometimes things are not going great at work, and that's when meeting outside of work is most important. So try to find that balance. Building relationships outside of work and at least one buddy at work. Build those coping skills that we talked about. Get enough sleep. If you need medications, get on them. If you need medications to sleep, just take a look at it. I feel like if you're not getting any sleep, find a way to get some sleep. Water and eat. The hot walk and talk is invaluable. Make sure you're doing that. And know your signs and get real about what's happening. It's not something to feel shame about. It's just a part of the work, and it's a part of the overburdened system that we work in. So next slide. Okay. Guess that is it. I kind of sped through that. Cool. All right. I've been
There
really
is one question that I would love for you to answer, and then we'll get into our case presentation.
great. Okay. I've been really open with my supervisor with how overwhelmed I am with my caseload. It seems to just get brushed aside every time. Tips and how to handle that. Yeah. So this is really difficult because I feel like, making sure that you're caring for yourself is one thing. And we talked about those strategies, but it's difficult when you are actually sharing your voice. You're talking to your supervisor and you're not being heard. And within your system, it's you're going to have directives and protocol to follow. And it may say to go to the next level at this point. So if you feel like you've been entirely clear about what you need, you could, take it up a notch and go to their supervisor. You could even, and follow the protocol of your organization. However, another strategy that you could use is taking a look at this. You could throw me under the bus. And you could identify that these are some some organizational practices that really increase risk. I mean, one of the things I didn't talk about was turnover, that these factors are what contribute to turnover. But I feel like at this point you've done everything right and you need an advocate. Pets always help too. Yeah, you're so right. Yep, pets help. I didn't mention that, but they are so healing, and it's healing just to care for something outside of work. Okay, yeah. So this is so frustrating because every system is so different. And when you're being very clear about what's happening and then your need, and you make a clear ask and it's not being heard, that is so frustrating. Yeah, I guess you've let them know the impact that this has had on you, and that and you've clearly asked to transition some clients from your case to someone else. I know that, if you already present a solution or something that you're asking for, that increases the chances that there'll be follow through. But I'm sorry, I'm not very helpful on this because every system is so different. There's nuance. I don't want to give you a specific direction to go in and not knowing the cultural norms of your organization, but that is really frustrating. Yeah. I do think it always helps to come to them with, yeah, absolutely. Yep. Yeah, having a real clear ask and a solution to your problem.
Thanks, Allison. And thank you for who shared that with us. We really appreciate your honesty and feel for you.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Okay, Jessica, do you want to take it over?
Yep, I'm happy to. So we're going to have our case presentation now, and the purpose of our case presenters is to have people share their stories, to create a safe space to talk about some hard topics and to really show resilience in action. Today's case presentation does have a trigger warning. There is some emotionally triggering topics around traumatic childhood experiences and substance use. So if you feel the need, feel free to log off. We will record this presentation and send it out for later viewing. We are allowed to record this, correct, Krista? Do we have consent to record this? Okay, I was just double checking, sorry. So we'll go ahead and introduce MacKenzie Larson. Kenzie was born in Minot and moved to Wisconsin right before she started middle school. She grew up in Wisconsin and made her way back to North Dakota to attend the University of North Dakota. She's now a UND graduate with a double major in marketing and management. She is a certified peer support specialist at Independence Inc., and she works with individuals that face substance abuse and mental health diagnoses. She uses her shared lived experience to help individuals navigate their way through any obstacle that they may encounter. She's an active member of the recovery community and works with others to help them succeed. She continues to use her position as a platform to help those who have experienced trauma and substance abuse to see that there is a way out. So please help me welcome MacKenzie.
Hello. Thank you so much for allowing me the opportunity to share my story today. So my mental health and my substance abuse probably started when I was really young. I came from a really dysfunctional household. My mom had her fair share of mental health issues, and my father was an alcoholic. My parents were never together growing up, so I didn't really know what that was like to have a nice, quaint, little peaceful dinner type thing. That just was never in the cards for me. I remember when I was really young, like my father was still drinking and things like that, and I'd be really scared to be in the house and, you know, finding intoxication and things like that. And I was, mind you, this was all before the age of 8 years old, so it was really difficult for me to comprehend because I was just seeking that nurturing, that love, that companionship that your parents are supposed to give you, and I didn't have that. And it's, I mean, I understand it now, especially with my own addiction and things like that, that addiction is cunning and baffling, and it's a vicious disease that takes hold of one's livelihood and makes you do things that you never would have done otherwise. And I can see that now, hindsight's 2020, but being a little girl, I didn't understand that. How something could be way more important than me. My mom placed an ultimatum that my father could not spend time with me if he was intoxicated. He couldn't drink in my presence. So we tried this out for a little while, only to come to find out that I would wake up from a nightmare or something like that and see that my dad would indulge in the alcohol while I was sleeping. So I'd wake up and all these beer cans would be lying down the side of the couch, and I couldn't wake him up, and I'm terrified from my nightmares, and it was scary. It was really scary. It still has a traumatic effect on me today. Eventually got to the point where I didn't want to spend the night there anymore because I was terrified. And because of his addiction, things didn't work out, and he didn't really want to have it in my mom's favor per se, that he basically wanted me to be able to stay there all the time. And so eventually got to the point where I wouldn't stay there at all. And shortly after this, my dad passed. He drowned going after a 6-pack of beer. So it's really put this foundation in me that I don't matter. If I don't matter to my own parents, then who would really care about me, I guess. There was a girl that was with him at the time, my best friend, and this was in a gravel pit that he drowned, and she grabbed for his hat, or grabbed for him, excuse me, and only pulled back his hat. So for the next 20 years, I kept thinking I could have saved him if I would have been her. Alcohol is more important than me. There was also a poem that he wrote from treatment because he was trying to get his life back together, but it didn't end that way. He wrote me a poem right before he passed that said, "Dear Lord, give me one last chance to see my daughter smile before my last dance." I never got that opportunity. He never got that opportunity. And so I was really like resentful toward my mom and toward this addiction. And I didn't know how to process my own emotions really, because I hadn't learned how. I was just a baby. And there was also there was a voicemail an hour before he passed that was saying that he was returning my phone call. I just want to let me know that he loved me and missed me. I never called him. So just all these things of I could have, I would have, should have, at this very juvenile age that other people are just learning how to, you know, ride without tricycle or ride without training wheels and stuff like that. I was really like trying to process all this stuff and why and who and figure out this entire puzzle. And after my father had passed, my life wasn't a bed of roses per se. I still had a tumultuous relationship with my mother throughout that journey. There were a lot of emotional and mentally traumatic events that happened. And I just had this inherent belief that I wasn't worthy of love, that I wasn't good enough, that I'd never belong. Nobody wanted me. I was always going to be an outsider looking in. I was a black sheep everywhere I went. And that if I wasn't good enough for my dad, if I wasn't more important than alcohol, and if I'd never be good enough for my mom, then I just wasn't good enough, period. I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression at a very early age, and I've tried many medications throughout that way. I grew to hate alcohol because of what it did to my father, and I promised that I would never, ever, ever be like that. Until at age 14, I decided, might as well try it. And I still remember the girl that I was with, we had slushies, and she had poured vodka, and she was like, oh, that's gross. And I'm like, oh, well, just give me yours. So then I had 2 of them. And I found something that provided me comfort and relief that I've been craving my entire life. And I knew that I'd met my match, and that alcohol would eventually be my demise. This resulted in years of experimenting with different drugs and alcohol and things like that. But the one thing that I can say is that throughout the course of my developmental years, my high school, college, things like that, it was also my only constant. The only thing that didn't let me down, the thing that I could count on. I knew what the result would be if I ingested this substance. And I believe that a lot of this throughout the course of my life, that the alcohol and drugs were the only thing that provided me this comfort, because it's a comfort that I was seeking from my adverse childhood experiences. I also let it become a justification to continue the way that I was living, because if you would have experienced the things that I had, if you would have gone through what I had, you'd do it too. You have no idea what it's like to be me. I kind of carried that like my badge of honor, my justification, my rationalization for my behaviors. I knew in my soul, though, that I was worth so much more, and there were little glimmers of hope along the way. I did manage to get into college, and I graduated from the University of North Dakota, despite my party lifestyle. I continued after college with partying and things like that. Not saying I didn't have a lot of success throughout my journey, but that was, like I said, the constant for those, 10, 15 years. And there were several valleys and rock bottoms throughout my life. It took a lot of trial and error to become the woman that I am today, a woman of integrity and recovery and being at peace within myself. Like, I'm a really, really awesome person, but it took me a lot to get there. Rock bottom became the foundation upon which I was able to rebuild my life. And I'm incredibly grateful for every trial and tribulation that I have encountered, because had I not, I may not be where I am today. So it was all in some bigger plan that I didn't know. And now, because of my situations, it's provided me to work as a peer support specialist, and I use my position to help other people the way that I wish I would have been helped. And I'm grateful for everything that I have, because I know what it was like to have nothing. I've been bankrupt in every essence of the term, financially, emotionally, mentally, spiritually, physically, all of the above. So now if you ever encounter me, you'll probably hear me be really grateful and really kind to everybody, because when you lose everything, you really become appreciative for the little things. Due to my childhood trauma and the traumatic experiences that I experienced throughout my adulthood, which those were no bed of roses either. They were just as equally as traumatic, which is the irony with addiction. You think that you're trying to save yourself and numb yourself when you're really just reintroducing an entire new form of trauma. So I was diagnosed with CPTSD. So I have complex PTSD from my childhood trauma and the trauma that I experienced throughout my adulthood as well. I still cope with it every single day, but I just try to learn how to manage it and not let the residual anxiety consume me and define me. I experience vicarious trauma, kind of like what Alison had spoke about. And I get that a lot of times with people that I'm working with, or just even people in the recovery community that seek me out for advice or something like that. And I have to recognize that this is not my energy. I cannot take this on, but it does trigger it for a moment there. It also shows me where I have grown to see how I would have handled that situation maybe differently 3 years ago, as opposed to where I handle it today. I'm very hyper vigilant, and this makes me extremely aware of things, which I have actually turned ironically into a positive thing, because now I just make connections with literally everything. So it's become like an art form to me almost. So like I notice things like I'll notice numbers and symbols and the bird if I'll see it 3 different times in a day, and I journal about all these little connections that most people probably would take for granted. And it's something that's really like helped me through. My life in recovery has also shown me that I didn't just choose to take on alcohol and drugs because I wanted to. It was unresolved trauma that I hadn't dealt with from my childhood, and it was the only thing that gave me a little breather, a little relief, a little control in a life that I had never had control of. I have to really be continually keeping myself in check because of what happened to me, and be aware of my triggers and recognizing how much power that I allow them to have. Because if I want to, I can let that fear go and it will be intense, but I have the power of my mind to allow that. Or if I can write down, like many times throughout the day, every single day, I have to write down, I have nothing to fear here. I am safe and I am protected. I am blessed and I am grateful. Reframe, all right, mosey on with my day. And that's just a reality check for me, because otherwise my traumatic responses will get me over to Timbuktu before I've even left town. Like, some different things that also help me is, like I said, being able to refill my cup every day, my journaling, my art. I do a lot of different things, like I sage, I do meditations, just anything that can help me in that moment. I still, like I said, I have to train my brain to not be in this constant fight, flight, or freeze or appease. I just learned now. So that's like a continual thing for me. Some healing resources that I've really found to be beneficial. Every morning when I wake up, I have this thing on YouTube that comes up, and it's 5 minutes by Grit Meditation. It's just balance or self-love. It's what prompts it every morning for me, which is really great when I wake up at 6:26 a.m. And then I do daily devotionals. I have like an NA reading, an AA reading. I have a Bible verse sent to me every morning. I analyze my dreams and the subconscious healing that can result as because of that. And that's been like, I kind of geek out on it. It's been like my passion for the last 3 years, every single day. And then I delve into dream analysis, and I love it. It's been one of the most beneficial things to my recovery journey. I do daily journaling, making sure that I'm practicing gratitude continually. I sage, I meditate, I do grounding things. I have crystals that I rub. Like anything in the spiritual realm has provided me comfort and relief, and something that I've been seeking my entire life. And so I'm very, very grateful for that. I surround myself with good people, family, friends, coworkers, hang out with the people that want to see me succeed. Like I said, I make connections with everything, numbers. An awesome connection is that today would have been my father's birthday. So when Krista asked me to present, I'm like, all right, that's a sign, do it. So I'm telling you, like, this is how I live my entire life. And it's so much fun, because before I was just really, really sad every day. And now I get to find the gratitude in, oh, it's the 15th. All right, sure, sign me up. I have participated in therapy. I do go to a lot of 12-step programs. I have a sponsor. I do the water therapy thing too, hot bath, cold shower, things like that, just to reset myself. I set my goals, my gratitude, and my growth to see if I've handled something in a better way than I did even a week ago, because to me, that's a win. And I hope that I can be even better tomorrow. I listen to binaural beats when I go to bed at night, and each one is plugged into like a different, I think it's hertz. And so they do like a subconscious reprogramming of my trauma. So that's something that I take in a benefit. Some takeaways today, turning my pain into power. Own your story, because there's power in it. The struggle is worth the glory as long as you can make it out. I went through it for a reason. I'm resilient, and this is what I was supposed to be doing. I'm here to help others in the way that I wish that I could have been helped. And what an awesome opportunity. And I'm so blessed and grateful for that. And a quote that I found in the What Happened to You book was, when you find an addiction, do not be ashamed, be joyful. You have found something that you have come to your earth to heal. When you confront and heal an addiction, you are doing the deepest spiritual work that you can do on this earth. And that was by Gary Zukov. And thank you everybody so much for allowing me the opportunity to share my story. Thank you, Alison, for a great presentation. presentation, and I'm incredibly grateful for all of you.
Thank you so much, Kenzie. You always have to turn off your camera for, certain portions of these meetings, but that was a really, really impactful presentation. So we really appreciate you. Fun fact, I just happened to meet Kenzie at our friend Jamie's house, and a hot air balloon popped down, and we got to ride a hot air balloon in this random neighborhood. So it was meant to be that she would come and present in this series too. So thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you, Alison, for the amazing presentation. Please take a moment to fill out our survey. This helps us with future sessions, and also just seeing what everybody thought, and we make changes. We take all of the comments into consideration. We hope to see you at our next session, which is on March 1st, and it's going to be about communication tips with supervisors. So thanks again, everyone, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kenzie, and thank you, Alison. We really appreciate it. I should have read Abby's comment if MacKenzie didn't see it.